He did not just end an empire, he stepped into its ruins and decided that a nation could be rebuilt only if it was forced to stop looking backward. That was the first thing that made Mustafa Kemal Atatürk so powerful and so complicated. He emerged as a military hero during the collapse of the Ottoman world, most famously at Gallipoli, then became the central figure of the nationalist movement that rejected the post-war settlement imposed on the defeated empire. Britannica notes that after the Ottomans were beaten in World War I, Mustafa Kemal led the struggle against partition, helped secure international recognition of Turkish sovereignty through the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, and became the first president of the new republic. This is the version of Ataturk that many people know best. The rescuer, the founder, the man who turned a defeated imperial remnant into a modern national state. But the darker truth of his story begins almost immediately after that triumph. Because once he had won the republic, the question was no longer whether Turkey would survive. The question was, who would be allowed to shape what survival meant? Ataturk did not inherit a stable democracy and slowly harden it. He created a republic in a moment of emergency, and from the beginning, that republic carried the logic of command. The Assembly declared Turkey a republic on October 29, 1923, and elected Mustafa Kemal as its first president. Within months, the caliphate was abolished, the Ottoman dynasty was expelled, and the new state set itself on a sharply secular course. These were enormous changes, and they were not merely administrative. They were civilizational in ambition. The old imperial vocabulary of the Ottoman order, dynasty, caliphate, religion intertwined with state, was being stripped away at high speed. Ataturk believed and said in practice, if not always in those exact words, that Turkey could not become modern by negotiating gently with the political and cultural habits of the past. It had to break from them. That belief gave him enormous energy. It also laid the foundation for the great contradiction of his life. He was building a republic, but not one that could yet tolerate open struggle over what the republic should be. He was creating modern Turkey, but he was doing it from above, with the conviction that too much political looseness could unravel the nation before it was fully born. That is what makes his story so strong for dark political history. Ataturk did not simply rescue a country. He rescued it in a way that made concentrated power feel like the midwife of modernity. The republic he built was new, but it was not politically open in the way the word republic often suggests. That is where the second layer of drama begins. Britannica's history of early republican Turkey says the assembly was essentially the instrument of Mustafa Kemal's will. The first assembly had contained significant hostile factions, including religious conservatives, merchants, and former members of the Committee of Union and Progress. When it was dissolved in April 1923, Mustafa Kemal made sure his opponents were largely excluded from the Second Assembly. Only 3 members of the hostile second group returned. His own party, which became the Republican People's Party, then dominated all assemblies until 1950. That is not a minor detail. It means the Turkish Republic was born inside a political chamber already being narrowed by its founder. Ataturk did experiment with opposition, but only within limits that reveal more about his instincts than any speech could. Britannica records that the small Progressive Republican Party, formed in late 1924, survived only until June 1925, when it was suppressed because Mustafa Kemal feared that its leading members, many of them famous associates from the War of Independence, might acquire too much influence in the army. Later, in 1930, he encouraged the creation of a moderate opposition party led by his longtime associate Ali Fethi, only to crush it when it became immediately and overwhelmingly popular. This is one of the coldest truths about Ataturk's republic. He seemed willing to test opposition only when it remained safely decorative. Once it looked real, once it suggested that the public might choose a political future not fully scripted by the founding elite, the experiment ended. Britannica says plainly that otherwise he ruled quite autocratically. A 1926 plot against his life gave him the opportunity to deal with rivals through special courts, and many of them received death sentences, imprisonment, or exile. The Republic, in other words, was not simply defended by law. It was defended by selective elimination. This does not erase the historical pressures of the time. The state was fragile, the empire had just collapsed, regional and ideological threats were real, and many of the ruling elite believed that without a strong center, the entire project could fail. But that is exactly why the story is so compelling. Ataturk did not reject political freedom because he had no larger vision. He rejected meaningful political competition because he believed his vision was too important to risk. The scandal was not corruption. It was the way founding authority and national emergency fused into a system that could call itself Republican while refusing to let Republican uncertainty truly breathe. Then came the part of the story most often remembered as triumph, the reforms, and they were extraordinary. Britannica says Ataturk modernized Turkey's legal and educational systems, encouraged a European way of life, shifted written Turkish to the Latin alphabet, and helped lay the foundations of what became known as Kemalism. The caliphate was abolished. Religious schools and institutions lost their old centrality. In 1928, the clause naming Islam as the state religion was removed from the constitution, and Turkey formally became a secular republic. The new state introduced European-style names, encouraged new dress and social norms, rewrote school curricula, purified the language, and reorganized public life around secular nationalism rather than Ottoman Islamic imperial continuity. Britannica's article on Kemalist policies describes this as a radical reorganization of the political, social, and economic systems. It also makes clear that revolution was not an accidental byproduct. It was one of the 6 core principles of the new state. This is where Ataturk's greatness and severity become impossible to separate. He did not merely reform institutions. He tried to reprogram the symbolic operating system of an entire society. What counted as education, law, respectability, nationhood, history, even the alphabet on the page, all of it was made subject to redesign. And for many Turks, the result was electrifying. It meant literacy campaigns, secular schools, a new civic identity, and a determined attempt to place Turkey inside the modern 20th century rather than at the exhausted edge of a dying empire. But Britannica uses a phrase that should shape the whole tone of this part: forced modernization. That phrase matters because it strips away the softer myth of inevitability. Ataturk did not simply guide Turkey toward changes everyone already wanted. He drove those changes with the authority of a state that had decided speed mattered more than social consent. The reforms were not designed to ask society what kind of future it preferred. They were designed to make society adopt the future the state had chosen. This is what gives the Ataturk story its dark edge. He did not modernize by persuasion alone. He modernized by command, by curriculum, by constitutional redesign, by symbolic rupture, and by insisting that hesitation itself could become a threat to the nation's survival. That produced a new Turkey, but it also produced a political habit that would outlast him: the belief that the state has not only the right, but the duty to drag society forward faster than society may wish to go. And beneath those reforms was blood. Britannica is explicit on this point. The ambitious program of forced modernization, it says, was not accomplished without strain and bloodshed. In February 1925, Kurds in southwestern Anatolia rose in revolt in the name of Islam. The rebellion was suppressed in about 2 months, and its leader, Sheikh Said, was then hanged. Britannica's broader history of the Turkish Republic adds that dangerous Kurdish revolts in 1925, 1930, and 1937 were all vigorously suppressed. These are not side notes to the reform story. They are part of its operating logic. When a founding regime defines itself through radical secularization, centralized nationalism, and the destruction of older political religious structures, those who resist are rarely treated as mere dissenters. They are treated as obstacles to the nation itself. That is how blood enters modernization by command. The new state did not simply argue with religious and ethnic opposition, it crushed it, and then folded that crushing into the mythology of national salvation. A similar pattern appears in the aftermath of the 1926 assassination plot. Britannica says the 13 ringleaders were tried and hanged, and there were other trials and executions as well. To be fair to the historical record, Britannica also says the country was steered toward becoming a modern state with a minimum of repression. But that phrase does not soften the underlying fact. Even minimum repression in a founding moment can be lethal and transformative when the state controls courts, defines threats broadly, and equates its own program with national necessity. This is where Ataturk's reputation becomes especially difficult to narrate cleanly. He was not a random despot indulging cruelty for pleasure. The violence of the early republic came wrapped in a theory of national rescue. The state believed it was fighting not simply religious reaction, regional revolt, or political rivalry, but the possibility that Turkey might slip back into fragmentation, weakness, and historical humiliation. That belief does not erase the force used against its enemies. It helps explain why the force seemed justified to those who wielded it. And for your channel, that is exactly where the dramatic weight sits. Not in scandal as gossip, but in scandal as founding contradiction. Ataturk's republic promised modern citizenship, but it often met resistance with extraordinary coercion. It claimed to represent the nation, yet it reserved the right to decide which parts of society counted as obstacles rather than participants. It turned progress into doctrine, and when doctrine met resistance, the state answered with the rope, the court, and the gun. That is why Mustafa Kemal Atatürk remains one of the most difficult founders to tell honestly. His achievements are too vast to ignore, and his methods are too severe to romanticize away. Britannica is clear about both halves of the legacy. He founded and modernized the Republic of Turkey, transformed its legal and educational systems, secularized the state, and laid down the principles of Kemalism, republicanism, nationalism, populism, statism, secularism, and revolution, which were written into the Constitution in 1937. He also created a republic in which his party dominated, meaningful opposition was suppressed, and modernization was enforced from above with a willingness to use autocratic methods and, when necessary, bloodshed. Those two truths do not cancel each other out. They define each other. Ataturk's greatness was inseparable from the way he understood power. He did not believe Turkey could be slowly negotiated into modernity. He believed it had to be driven there, and he did drive it there with astonishing speed. The result was a country that left behind the imperial, dynastic, and confessional structure of the late Ottoman world and became a secular nation-state with a radically different civic identity. But the price of that transformation was a republic that did not learn pluralism at birth. It learned discipline first. It learned that the state could move ahead of society and demand obedience in the name of history. It learned that founding legitimacy could be used to narrow politics long after the founding moment. This is the unresolved tension at the heart of Ataturk's legacy. He is remembered, revered, and still omnipresent in Turkey, as Britannica notes. His portrait remains everywhere. His memory still structures political language. Yet the very scale of that presence also hints at the other side of the story. The founder became so central that the Republic often looked less like a field of contesting voices and more like the permanent echo of one man's decision about what Turkey should become. That is why he fits your format so well. He was not corrupt in the usual sense. He was not a family dynast. He was not a clownish despot. He was something colder and, historically, more consequential. A nation builder who treated political freedom as secondary to transformation and who proved that a republic can be born modern and still be born tight-fisted. He ended an empire, yes. But he also began a state that could not yet trust its own people with real opposition.